Good morning, guys. I believe when we stopped, we had just been where George Washington was made a major. Does that sound right? Let's see. He was a major and he had just realized that maybe Americans were going to be a little different than the English. So we are on chapter 5, which is called George's First Command. And here is an illustration. It starts out talking about his militia. That's a good word to look up, guys. Chapter 5, George's First Command. The war against the French and Indians was coming close to the borders of Virginia. Refusing to provide further assistance to George Washington's forces after the defeat of General Braddock, the Redcoats moved the rest of their troops north to Philadelphia. That left Washington and his small band of militiamen alone to defend the Virginian frontier. It seemed like an impossible task. The French troops were well equipped with guns, and the Indians had long knives. They paraded along the 350-mile-long border of Virginia with belts full of the scalps of defenseless colonists. George Washington received a frantic letter from the office of the Royal Governor of Virginia. "We must fight and defeat the French and their Indian allies before they conquer Virginia," the letter said. "You are the only man with the skill and courage to command a force against our wicked enemies. And now you also have the battlefield experience. Will you agree to serve?" Oops, wrong way, this way. Washington, still only 24 years old, was flattered, but he was also cautious. "I don't wish to be considered a mere volunteer," he thought to himself. "I am a professional soldier now. In order to secure a victory over the enemy, I must have enough troops, equipment, and authority." While he was mulling over these thoughts, more letters arrived, begging him to serve. They came not only from the governor's office, but also from other important men in the House of Burgesses, Virginia's assembly. "With all due respect," George Washington wrote, "I cannot serve unless I have a realistic chance to win. Therefore, I will need £40,000, the authorization to raise a 1,000-man army, promotion to the rank of full colonel, and the position of commander-in-chief." Washington received an immediate reply to his message. "All your requests are granted," it said. As she had so often in the past, Mary Washington stepped in to try to disrupt her son's plans. "Have you still not had enough fighting?" she asked. "I'm quite sure someone else can be found." Washington's answer was short. "Please remember, dear mother, that I did not seek this assignment. I was asked to serve, and it would be dishonorable for me to refuse. You should be more concerned about my honor than about my going." Shortly after, George had an encounter with a politician named William Payne. It was election time in the town of Alexandria, and Payne was running for the House of Burgesses against one of Washington's friends. Passing Payne in the street, Washington made a crude remark. Payne responded in a similar fashion. Tempers flared, and Payne, who stood barely as high as Washington's shoulder, struck the commander-in-chief of the Virginia Army with a hickory stick and knocked him flat on his back on the pavement. Bystanders rushed to assist Washington, but he got on his feet and walked away. The next morning, Payne received a message from Washington, requesting a meeting in the nearby tavern. The news traveled quickly, and a large crowd gathered at the meeting place. Expecting to witness a duel, the usual procedure in such cases was that the wronged party, in this case Washington, demanded an apology from his tormentor, failing which he would start a duel to avenge his honor. This time, the spectators were disappointed. There were no dueling pistols inside. Instead, Colonel Washington sat alone at a table, with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses in front of him. When Paine approached the table, Washington rose and held out his hand. He completely towered over the little politician. Here's an illustration showing him sitting at the table, inviting Paine to join him. Mr. Paine, I believe that I made a mistake by insulting you yesterday. I hope you will accept my hand and sit down for a drink with me. Let us be friends. Immediately, Paine was transformed from an opponent to a firm supporter of George Washington. Their friendship lasted a lifetime. Paine's family and his descendants, astonished by Washington's action, never tired of retelling the tale. The incident with Paine reflected Washington's maturity. He had grown into a self-confident man with firm control over his actions and emotions. He would need every ounce of this hard-won maturity when he returned to the savage war on the frontier. Although Governor Dinwiddie and the House of Burgesses had allotted money for soldiers and equipment for Washington's army, Washington himself had to obtain them. His attempts to recruit men were a nightmare. Far from agreeing to fight alongside him or to provide horses, wagons, or provisions for the army that was defending their homes and families, the frontier settlers cursed the army and even threatened the lives of Washington and his officers. Even the men who reluctantly agreed to join often did not obey orders. Washington tried to discipline them, but they spent much of their time drinking wine, stealing, and shirking their duties. I simply can't understand this behavior, Washington complained to his officers. Instead of fighting to protect their property, their wives, and their children, these recruits desert the army at the first opportunity. The situation is truly frightening. Every day, the French and the Indians set fire to farmhouses. So many innocent people have been captured and killed. When will all this misery end? Washington's supporters in Virginia wrote encouraging messages, urging him to keep up the good fight. Beverly Robinson, the Speaker of the Virginia House of Burgesses, writing on behalf of many of the delegates, said, "We have faith in you and are counting on you to bring this war to a happy conclusion." Washington's opponents appeared to outnumber his supporters, however. Even Governor Dinwiddie turned against him. He threatened an open investigation into charges of drunkenness, desertion, and immoral behavior among Washington's officers and troops. Washington, in turn, wrote letter after letter to the leaders of the colony, blaming them in part for his lack of battlefield successes. Despite his overall maturity and cool approach to problem solving, Washington remained extraordinarily sensitive to criticism. For 3 long years, Washington's Virginia army fended off French and Indian attacks and tried to protect the settlers and their families in the Ohio Valley. Washington's forces numbered 700 men, 2 for every mile of frontier. It wasn't enough to cope with the wave after wave of attacks. But Washington began to win the struggle against his troops' lack of discipline. He imposed drastic forms of punishment for such crimes as desertion. Once, for example, a sergeant and the men under his command deserted one of Washington's officers, who was then scalped by the warring Indians. Washington court-martialed the sergeant and condemned him to death. He requested the Virginia Assembly to give him the authority to carry out the sentence. The Assembly did so. Shortly afterward, Washington ordered the construction of a gallows 40 feet high. The two deserters were hanged. The war continued. Washington was very frustrated because the region where his army fought was considered less important than the North, which was closer to Canada, the heart of French power in North America. At long last, in November 1758, relief came. English forces led by Brigadier General John Forbes moved southward to join Washington. Together they drove the enemy away for good. The final outcome led Governor Dinwiddie once more to change his opinion of George Washington. "You've done an outstanding job, George," the governor praised the commander-in-chief. "You are a true hero of Virginia." "Thank you, sir," Washington replied. "It's been an honor to serve the colony of Virginia. But now I wish to retire from military life." Here's an illustration of him shaking the hand of the governor. And that, guys, is the end of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 is called Home at Mount Vernon.